The king still had his crown, but Paris was already slipping from his hands. Outside, the streets were filling with people who no longer feared the monarchy, and the man at the center of it all was Charles X. He believed authority could hold France together. He was about to discover otherwise. Within days, the capital would become a battlefield, and the king would run. For decades, the Bourbon family had fought to recover its lost power. The French monarchy had survived revolution, war, exile, and Napoleon. Now the Bourbons were back on the throne. Charles XVI inherited a throne that looked powerful, but rested on fragile ground. France had changed. The king wanted something older. He believed royal authority should stand above the growing demands of liberal politics. That difference would soon become a dangerous political battle. Then, in 1829, Charles X made a decision that changed everything. He brought Jules de Polignac into government as his leading minister. To his opponents, the new government looked like a step backward. The political temperature in Paris began to rise. Then came the election, and the king's opponents grew stronger. Charles X now faced a parliament that resisted him. Instead of retreating, he chose confrontation. On July 25, 1830, he issued the famous July Ordinances. The ordinances attacked the political order his opponents were defending. One measure sharply restricted the freedom of the press. For many Parisians, that was the moment patience finally broke. Printers protested. Citizens gathered. The streets began to boil. Paris was no longer waiting for the king's next move. The first shots rang out, and the city changed instantly. Barricades multiplied across the capital, and suddenly the king's capital was no longer under his control. Then came the moment Charles VI finally understood. His throne was in danger. For 3 days, Paris belonged to the revolutionaries. The fighting became known as the Three Glorious Days. The king's soldiers were fighting, but victory was slipping away. Every barricade was another piece of Paris lost. Inside the palace, the atmosphere became almost unbearable. The king was no longer deciding the future alone. His advisors were now discussing the possibility of retreat. But Charles X still had one weapon left: authority. The problem was that Paris had stopped listening, and the king's political enemies were moving faster than he was. A new political solution was beginning to emerge. The name at the center of that solution was Louis Philippe. He was not yet king, but the possibility was becoming real. For Charles X, that possibility was a warning. His capital was slipping away. His political authority was collapsing. And now the question was no longer how to rule. It was whether the king could save himself. The decision finally came. Charles X would abdicate, but surrendering the crown would not immediately end. The crisis France was already moving toward another ruler. Charles VI now faced a humiliating choice: stay and risk capture, or flee. The king chose escape. Behind him stood the capital he had failed to hold. Ahead lay an uncertain road and an uncertain future. The man who once commanded France was now a fugitive king. His journey carried him farther from the world he once controlled. And behind him, Paris was preparing to welcome a new era. The Bourbon Restoration had lasted only 15 years. Now Charles X was leaving France behind. He had possessed the crown, but the crown had not been enough. But Charles X's fall did not happen in isolation. His decisions had collided with a France that was no longer the same. The revolution exposed just how fragile royal power had become. A throne could command obedience, but it could not manufacture loyalty. And once that loyalty disappeared, the palace became strangely powerless. Louis Philippe was now positioned to take the throne, but his crown would look very different from Charles's. The new regime presented itself as a monarchy shaped by revolution. For Charles VI, there was no return to Paris. The capital that once celebrated him was now beyond his reach. But exile was only the beginning of his final chapter. The former king now had to live without a kingdom, yet France was not finished changing. The revolution had created expectations no king could easily control. People had learned that a government could be challenged, and that lesson would echo far beyond Charles X. Across Europe, rulers were watching carefully. If one king could fall, others wondered who might be next. The July Revolution had become a warning to every throne, but Charles X had another problem. His supporters had not disappeared. Some still believed the old monarchy could return. Others understood that France had crossed a political line. Charles himself would never regain the authority he had lost. His name remained royal, but his political power was gone, and France moved forward without him. Louis Philippe now faced the enormous task of keeping that revolution under control. He had inherited a throne born from unrest, and that made his position powerful but precarious. The revolution had changed the meaning of being king. A ruler could no longer simply assume obedience. He had to negotiate with the forces that had brought him there, and those forces would eventually challenge him too. The lesson of 1830 was already becoming larger than one king. It showed Europe that political power could move unexpectedly, and Charles X became one of its clearest examples. Yet the story of Charles X was not simply a story of personal failure. France itself had been transformed by decades of upheaval. The old order was facing a new generation. Young people wanted a voice in the future of their country. Workers wanted dignity, opportunity, and political recognition. The aristocracy wanted to preserve its influence, and the monarchy was caught between them. That tension made Charles's position increasingly dangerous. Then came the decisions that would ignite the final confrontation. The king believed decisive action could restore authority. His opponents saw something very different. They saw a government willing to cross a dangerous line, and Paris was ready to respond. The first barricades rose almost like a warning. Then the streets became a battlefield. For 3 days, Paris refused to surrender. The king's authority was collapsing street by street. Inside the palace, the mood changed completely. The confidence of the beginning had vanished. He finally understood that Paris could no longer be controlled. The decision to leave was no longer about strategy. It was about survival. The king who once commanded France was now fleeing it. Behind him, a new political era was already beginning. But Charles's supporters still hoped for another outcome. They imagined a return that never came. Instead, Charles entered a long and uncertain exile. His former kingdom became a memory carried from place to place. Yet his reign had left something behind, a warning about what happens when power stops listening. But Charles X's greatest legacy was not the throne he lost. It was the political lesson his downfall left behind. A monarchy could survive criticism. It could survive opposition, but it could not ignore an entire society forever. That was the deeper story behind the July Revolution. It was not simply about replacing one king. It was about changing who could shape France's future. And that question would continue troubling Europe. Revolution had shown that history could move faster than rulers expected. Charles X had learned that lesson too late. But France was only beginning another chapter. Louis Philippe's new monarchy would soon face its own challenges, because revolutions rarely solve every problem they expose. They simply open the door to new ones. And Charles X became a symbol of the old order, a ruler who believed authority could restore the past. But history was already moving somewhere else. His fall showed how fragile political certainty can be. 1 week of unrest had changed the course of a nation. One king had fallen, but the consequences would last much longer. His reign became a warning remembered by generations. The throne can look permanent, until the people decide otherwise. Charles X entered Paris as a king. He left it carrying the weight of a fallen reign, and that is how a king discovered that no throne is stronger than the people beneath it.